Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todos.
Good evening here. Welcome to this conversation, this online event run by the Culture Forum. We're going to address climate change from a very special perspective. The title is The Road for Lost Opportunities, The Race for Lost Opportunities. We tend to believe that there is a consensus we know that there's a consensus in society and in the science community about the consequences of climate change and global warming. In the next few minutes, we'll be trying to answer a number of questions that have been aroused over the last few years, which derive from this situation, including, for example, the mistrust by the citizenship towards some arguments or the lack of specific actions to check the destruction of the planet's resources. We'll also be wondering or questioning ourselves about the reason why the policymakers and the economic powers are not doing much in order to check our situation, which has been in the agenda of the media and the political summits for quite some time now, despite the experts' forecasts, which seem to have been assumed by nations. The lack of initiative or the delay in implementing them makes us wonder whether we're still in time to tackle what will happen unless we take measures, or whether we will continue to stay anchored in this constant delay of initiatives in favor of sustainable and a fairer development. And one of the topics of this conversation can be how to make the social people, the society, to move and work in favor of a just agenda rather than prioritizing economic private interests. Let me introduce our guests in today's session at the Culture Forum. In the first place, Jean Martin Fortier is a farmer, an author, an educator, and an advocate for ecological, human-scale, economically viable, sustainable agriculture. He's from Quebec, and he is the most influential garden farmer. I'm quoting an article in El País this year. He and his wife were the founders of Le Jardin de la Grelinette, a micro-farm south of Quebec, which is known for its high levels of yield and profitability by using low-tech, high-yield methods of production. Both professionals have initiated another project, or they have expanded the initial one by launching another project. Fortier is the author of The Market Gardener, which was recently published in Spain. It's one of the most influential books on garden farming, selling over 150,000 copies. And the most relevant thing is that he and his wife have been for 15 years or more making a living on half a hectare of farmland, and they feed a large number of families through a system of what they call baskets, and by being present at local markets in many places. Besides directing an educational film, he also runs the Market Gardeners Masterclass, an online program about successful farms on small acreages by using the power of soil biology with highly favorable yield outcomes. Hopefully he'll be telling us about the benefits and the difficulties too of biological economic agriculture, which right now is beginning to be seen as a solution for the future of our cities, through self-consumption, the vindication of something that is widely being talked about, food sovereignty, through the care of the earth, through techniques. And Jean Martin, how are you doing?
Buenos días, buenas tardes. Hablo un poquito español, pero no bastante bien para hacer toda la reunión en esta lengua, entonces voy a hablar en inglés, si posible, si es.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank you very much for joining us at the Forum of Culture. Can I introduce now our second guest, other guest, Philipp Blom. Philipp Blom, how are you doing?
Hello.
Good evening here.
Les presento, Philipp nació en Hamburgo.
Philipp was born in Hamburg in 1970. He's a historian, novelist, translator. He studied in several European cities, Vienna, Oxford, where he earned his PhD in modern history, and many of his books and publications deal with modern history. He has also published several novels, nevertheless, and one of his latest books, maybe the latest to date in Spain at least, can help us draw a number of conclusions on the topic under consideration. It's about the rise of nature. It's about reflecting on the consequences of climate disturbance that took place for about a century and a half in Europe, particularly a small sort of ice age, a decrease in mean temperature that had very important consequences, which may be related, we expect you to tell us something about that, with the search of modern world. Its impact was particularly severe in Europe, as you tell in your book. There was this radical drop in temperatures, besides other weather external phenomena that went along with it, which became quite frequent and eventually had a very important impact on harvests and on many other aspects of everyday life, both in Europe and elsewhere. Displacement of vineyard lands, diversification of crops, development as a result of new farming technologies, and an incipient trade, which at the time or until then did not exist in such a shape, including the exchange of currency. And this perhaps could be related to the beginning of the struggle and to the assumption of human rights, fundamental human rights, and as a result later of democracy. Philipp, thank you very much for joining us today, for being with us.
Thank you
for this round table. Okay, it's particularly interesting from my point of view, and perhaps we could start addressing these, perhaps in the order in which I introduce you, but anyway, the connection between climate change and a change in society at large. I would like to ask you, from your respective perspective, each his own, how do you think society is changing? What's the kind of change that society needs to assume as a result of the climate change that we are living through right now? Jean Martin, perhaps you can tell us your take on that.
I think the simple and straightest answer to this is that climate is changing. And we feel this in the field, like there's variation in temperatures that, I've been farming for 17 years full time, and last night we had -9 and snow, and tomorrow it's going to be +20. And so just to adapt to all these variation in temperatures when you're producing food, I'm a vegetable grower, is something. And I think this trend is not going to go away. At least that's what the data is telling us. And I'm not sure that the system, the food system and the industrial agriculture, developments that are out there will adapt to this, these changing conditions, these droughts, these cold weathers, these outpours of heavy rains. There's just going to be such dramatic changes, and resilience to this, in my opinion, is best done by small ecological farms that can maneuver better with these with this scenario.
I do think that, yes, I'm very excited to hear from Jean Martin, because we need this kind of work. I can tell you about catastrophes, but Jean Martin can tell you about practical solutions. Just very quickly to resume what you said, and perhaps to make a little, to span a little arch from the 17th century to today. In the Little Ice Age, we had a drop of temperatures by roughly 2 degrees, probably worldwide, but in Europe, you've got most documentation about it. And Jean Martin knows that better than I, but that corresponds to roughly 3 weeks of vegetation period. That's a long time for grain to ripen, for vegetables to ripen, for fruit to ripen. And that meant that there was turmoil in agriculture, that food supplies broke down, that there were famines, there was social unrest, etc. And you saw how a model broke down. I would say what we're seeing today is that a model breaks down. that a model that is highly extractive, that uses nature only as a repository that you can do with what you want. You know, in classic economic theory, all natural resources are externalities that you don't have to incorporate into your calculations. They will always be there. There will always be clean water. This extractive way of living, it's not just farming, but it's living, is what gives us economic growth. I think it goes back to the biblical injunction to subjugate the earth, and we are the only culture that did that. We are learning now that this model is coming to its end because we are suffocating from the side effects of our enormous success. And we are now learning that there must be an alternative model. And that, I think, is embodied by what Jean Martin does, because it is a solidaric model, it's a cooperative model. It has to mean that we learn we cannot subjugate the earth. We are a kind of parasite on the face of the earth, and most clever parasites don't kill off their host. We must learn to live in some kind of balance with the rest of nature to which we belong, and then perhaps we'll have a chance.
Jean Martin, no sé si querías añadir algo a este tema.
Jean Martin, you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to say that I agree so much with how Philipp has framed all of this, and yeah, I would add that how I see this in a slight positive way is that interacting with nature, you know, in my case, we're doing applied soil ecology, learning how to harness the power of nature and use it to what we want to do. You know, a small ecological farm does that, and learning all of this for me personally has been the best adventure of my life. And so there's an upside to this, where when we learn how to live within the boundaries of nature and actually interact with the processes and with our intelligence, harness the power of nature for our ends instead of just trying to subjugate it and kind of to bypass it. It comes to be very creative and very empowering and very, very incredible, actually. And so I think it's our generation's duty to teach this and learn this and pass it on. And that's the upside in the revolution that I think we're about to really start here.
Me gustaría preguntaros si precisamente...
I would like to ask you if that small revolution that you were talking about, Jean Martin, has enough meaningfulness in local communities for it to be effective. There's a saying, which is think global and act local. Is it the way we're doing? Are we working or acting on a local level, but in such a generalized way as for it to produce outcomes that are noticeable?
Again, another great question. And my answer to this question is that I've seen through all these years of me doing this. So, you know, we're not just farming, we're also selling directly to people that come and get our produce, and we create a relationship that is carbon neutral, that is very benign, beneficial on all fronts. It's a very human contact, you know, people coming to the farmer and then the farmer coming to the client, the people. But anyway, all this to say that once people taste this way of feeding themselves and interaction, it becomes something that grows, and you build community like that, and you build right relationships. And I'm not the one that can say these kind of relationships will outgrow the current way people are fed. But what I know is that every time this connection is reactivated or ignited, it's positive and it's multiplying. And it's multiplying, you know, wherever you lay your eyes on. In North America, in Europe, in countries like South America, also it's happening. And it's responding to a need. And so will this movement, you know, overcome the destruction of the industrial food system? I don't know, but it's definitely something that is positive and happening and growing and multiplying. So the way around this question for me is not if we can feed the world, but if we can feed our community. And we focus on that, and And that in itself is a very interesting goal, and it gives us power.
May I ask you one question? What you say sounds wonderful. How does that work for big cities, communities in big cities?
Yeah, I think it works by having a lot of smaller farms in the outskirts that go into the city once, twice, 3 times a week, depending. And most of my clients are in the city. So we feed, 250 families, and I leave from my farm and I drive to the city, and then we meet, we connect, they get their food. It's just about for them to change their habits, where it's not like there's a 24/7 supermarket that's open year round with all the produce. It's different. They need to commit to a timetable where I come. And this model can be changed and altered, but I think it's the outskirts where there's a lot of farms, and in cities, people do what they do in cities, and that's how Paris was fed for 200 years. And Paris, in the 1900s was a 5 million person city. So I know that it's possible, and it's going to need a lot more farms, though, to feed those cities, and that's my life's work.
Philipp, ¿cómo ves tú esta situación? ¿Cómo piensas que deberíamos...
How do you think we should adapt the teachings that we may draw from current events and situations that have already happened? For example, the one you tell about in your book, this riot of nature, to the present time, where this overexploitation of natural resources may lead us to a limit or extreme situation.
I think that doesn't work through arguments. It only works through experiences. That you can change a way of thinking and a way of living. You can't tell someone, I've got a better argument, I'm cleverer than you, I've got all the data, I've got all the studies. That makes exactly no difference to people. In the 17th century, the breakdown of the system as it was engendered new methods of doing things. There were new kinds of knowledge, many of which weren't very successful, black magic, alchemy, mysticism, but one of which survived, empirical science. And it engendered a new way of being. It engendered a new kind of person, namely people who were in cities and could read and write and count and could trade, and you could make good food shortfalls by trade, and with trade come ideas. And so the world really did begin to change, society began to change. And I think you see a very similar process today. You see that one story is breaking down, the story that we're the boss of nature, and that we can, through technology, through science, or through sheer arrogance, control everything. And you see how that experience, which we're all experiencing with the coronavirus for the first time, a real shared experience worldwide, where people, not a good experience, but a shared one, where people are understanding we're not outside of nature. A stupid little chain of RNA, a very primitive virus, can make the most advanced economies in the world crash within days. And all of us are sufficiently organic beings to have to shield and protect ourselves from not picking this thing up. That's quite a powerful experience, and it's not going to be, unfortunately, the only experience of this kind for the next years. And I think when one thing no longer works, people have to think, well, what are the alternatives? What could we also do? And you see that now, that the vacuum that the story of the master of nature has left, which is, the latest iteration of which is neoliberalism, which is the mastery of the market. But this story is crumbling, it's breaking down, and this vacuum that it leaves is filled by other stories, is filled by other kinds of knowledge, by other attempts to explain things. Some of them are conspiracy theories. Some of them are right-wing coups, other are ecological utopias. They're of different kind. And I think that's quite important because we're seeing how our shared experience is shifting our perspective on the world, but we're also seeing that there's a sort of conflict of stories. I would even call it a war of storytelling, of narratives. And it's not necessarily the nicest one that's going to win and inform policies and inform how societies do things. It is quite possible, as we see in the States these days, at recording, it's in the middle of the American elections, and we see that half of the Americans are perfectly fine with the person their president is. Not only the liberals, the liberals may be aghast, but most Americans seem to be, or many Americans seem to be perfectly fine with this, although he tramples all of their values with his feet as well. It is not evidence that changes minds, it's experience. And when we begin to make the experience that A, what we used to do is no longer working, and B, as Jean Martin shows us, what we can do may work. And what we can do may actually work in a more satisfying way, in a more healthy way than what we used to do. I'm sure that Jean Martin's vegetables taste a lot nicer than what you get in a lot of supermarkets. And once you catch a taste of that, you may not want to go back. And you miss out on the choice of having avocados every day and lemons in the deepest winter. But, you know, perhaps that's a trade worth making. And I think there we're at the beginning of something exciting.
Y sin embargo, parece que está costando que cale esta...
And yet it appears that it's been hard for society to assume these arguments. Perhaps we should try to speed up deadlines for a discussion and for these experiences to really have an impact on society, for everyone to be aware of the need to change the productive model and address climate change. We've reached a time or a point, and you were mentioning Trump's followers, that it appears that a large portion of society, not the whole of society, but a large part of society follows him through beliefs rather than certainties or arguments. How can we combat this kind of systems of beliefs in order to promote a change and development that right now people like Jean Martin are proposing through their own work and experience?
I don't think you can. There is no magic bullet. There is no magic solution. You can create opportunities, you can create possibilities of doing things differently, but you cannot ram this thing down people's throats, and you cannot install a perfect eco-dictator. You know, this is the vulnerability of democracies. Democracies are actually made to slow decisions down, because people were fed up with some degenerate prince rolling out of bed in the morning and say, I know we're going to war. And so, you know, now you have structures of power that things need to trickle down, and that makes the system very slow. That's a good thing in itself, but at a time when fast and radical action is really necessary, and most people don't see the problem, you're going to be at the mercy of the regenerative power of nature, quite frankly. And we don't know how strong that is, but we can't stop the destruction tomorrow. You know, the thing is, you said, you know, live local and think global. The problem is there are no longer any local problems. If in the Brazilian rainforest and other rainforests, I once read a statistic and I had to research it 3 times in 3 different sources, but it appears to be true. In the last year, 30 football fields of rainforest were destroyed every minute. That is not a local problem in Brazil. That is a problem where I am in Austria, that's a problem in Quebec, that's a problem in Spain. And we cannot tell the people of Brazil to do business differently. We are at a point where human understanding is beginning to be too slow for the amount of revolutions and of transformations that are taking place. And I think the best kind of thing that can happen is that people like me try to write books, people like you try to have discussions that I hope reach many people, and people like you, Jean Martin, show people that there are actual practical solutions, how you can do things differently, and that that doesn't mean that your life is going to be poorer, that your life is going to be less interesting, but on the contrary, it could actually mean that it could actually mean a positive transformation. But it is an uncertain path.
Well, I really appreciate listening to you, Philipp, and I thank you for all these wise, the wise understanding of what's going on, and it really resonates with me. That's how I see things. Listening to you describe this, for me and the people that work alongside us, things haven't changed really. We do what we do, and we adapt. And we struggle because that's what farmers do, every day. We don't really know. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're dealing with nature. We're planting crops. We're planting a lot of crops. Some succeed, some don't. We try to manage insect pressures. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. And so, in my opinion, small ecological farmers are kind of well designed for survival of the fittest in a way. We've learned how to adapt to constant changes in with the environment, and I think there's something to share there. And what I've observed is that there's a lot of younger people that want to work on farms, and I don't know if there's a mystical force at play here, but there's a sense that in the next 20 years you might be better off on a farm that in a city. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong about that, and I don't want to preach anything here, but it's just there's something to say about self-sufficiency, and then you extend that to community sufficiency and the whole resilience, and that's very experimental. Like that's how we live things, that's how we understand. And there might be a comeback to that, and it might be that I hope I don't have the burden to feed my whole community tomorrow, because I can't do that. My farm's not big enough, and I would need, frankly, to probably protect my crop from the mob of people wanting to eat. But anyway, the journey that I'm living is actually a good one, and the transformation that might happen might be positive also. So there's going to be suffering, but there's what I do is very positive, and the people that are around that are transformed by what we do, it's all positive in the way. So
I mean, just to perhaps add something to that, you asked what can we do, and I think on a cognitive level and on a philosophical level, and it sounds a bit stupid, but I think it's quite important. Let's accept that we are animals. Let's accept that we are part of nature. Let's accept that we have a kind of human nature, which for instance means that if we feel under pressure, if we feel afraid, then we become aggressive. Then we retreat. Then we retreat into what we want to believe to be the truth and not what we can see is the truth. And that's what's happening in many ways today. I think creating situations in society where people are not under stress, not under pressure, giving people a realistic sense of hope in a realistic future. Who has that today? Which politician talks about that? This is what this country could be in 2050. This is the kind of society we could have. This is how we could adapt to climate change that is happening and we can no longer stop. This is how this could be good for us. I think if we could give that to people, if we could encourage that in society, then there would be some kind of motivation for people to re-engage with this process and to want to be part of it. At the moment, we're leaving it all to a market that is not helping us when it should, that didn't have all the supplies when the coronavirus hit us. that didn't deliver it where it was most needed. I think when we realize we are part of nature, and by yanking ourselves out of nature into highly artificial environments where we make fewer and fewer actual analog experiences, that's perhaps a puzzling thing for the primate we are. Perhaps we're actually overloading ourselves with stuff that we cannot integrate into our evolutionary experience of so many hundreds of thousands of years. We tend to see ourselves as rational and free and self-determined, and we may be none of those things. We may be just one more primate that has more success with symbolic thinking and opposable thumbs than others have had. But that is, for that matter, not out of nature at all, and will only find some kind of equilibrium in himself if it also can find an equilibrium with the world around him.
Pero fíjate, Philipp, que tú dices en tu
Yes,
libro...
Philip, in your book, which I've mentioned several times, that we are the first generation in history that has a relatively clear understanding of what our inheritance or legacies for the future generations. I would like to ask you both precisely about the role that you believe society will play, even above or beyond governments and nations that do not seem to be taking the right choices or the clear choices that we need in the face of the future in order to check the effects of climate change and global warming, whether you think that it is society ultimately above governments and beyond them, because I think that you made both of you a difference between citizens' initiative and that of politicians. So perhaps it will be societies, and within them the younger generations will lead these changes. Would you agree with that?
My opinion about this is, you know, I've thought for many years that, you know, politicians and politics always act afterwards when the change is already underway, and that's when they kind of intervene. And so it's, in my opinion, it's not up to them to create the change. They're more, you know, they follow the change, and they kind of jump on the bandwagon when it's already kind of going. And so if we're serious about creating change, I see that we need to empower more and more people to be the change, to create the change, to just empower themselves to do things, and not just put the burden on an institution or, you know, a higher power that's not theirs. And that's very paralyzing also. And so that's how I've always seen things, and that's why I'm an entrepreneur, and then I work with people that are creating projects and doing projects. And I think that younger generations, the millenniums and the people coming, that's how they'll operate in the world. They'll do projects, and they'll want to be in control and work together towards something. And for me, where I don't see my limit to my scope on this is how this kind of, all of these little hubs can work together into one big hub and create a broader, you know, general common work. I can't really see now how this is going to happen, but I'm sure it will. It always has.
You're standing in front of it.
Yeah.
You're standing in front of that principle. And also, I always think, as a way of thinking, you know, our thinking is dividing and defining clearly and not having interconnecting lines. But plants don't. Plants communicate through their roots. And if you look at a plant, you look at a tree trunk, and you know that's the tree, but how far does the tree go under the earth? And when does it become the next tree? And I think that is a real inspiration for also how social change and social organization could work.
There's definitely a lot of lessons in nature, and that's why I think that that's the power is there. It's like, at one point, I think humanity, the way we've been living it for, you know, perhaps 2,000 years, or I don't know, at least 200, we're going to look back and say, wow, we were destroying nature where we should have been exploring it, understanding it, feeling it, feeding off of it, harnessing it. And that's where really I connect with your message, Philipp, is that the answers are within us, you know, but within nature, and the teaching is there. The way forward is understanding nature, and unfortunately we're destroying it very rapidly. So I don't know if there's going to be enough of it left for us to really understand how natural systems work. But if that happens, then that's going to be the end of us, and that's it. And we're just going to reignite into something different, and the transformation is going to be complete. And so I don't know.
Precisamente la sobreexplotación
overexploitation of resources is still causing in the 21st century the displacement of large masses of population because they do not have the available resources and the soil and the land that used to be theirs. I'm thinking about some indigenous communities, for example. These are issues that affect not just the theoretically developed countries, it's globally affecting the whole planet. From your point of view, what should change? How should we reorient ourselves, both as a society, as nations, to their policies, for this to really stop being the way it is, for us to take the path of recovery and begin or cease to overexploit resources in such a way as we run out of them and end up in the limit situation that we've been referring to from the beginning of this conversation.
Philipp, if I can start on this one and just tell you,
Philipp, que empiece yo.
In my opinion, when large populations move away, or when we say there's not enough resources, that's not the whole story, because there is ways to organize better, to capture rainwater, to grow plants in the desert. There's all sorts of clever ways that we know how to do. We know how to rehabilitate natural systems and to live in harmony with them sustainably. We know how to do this. It's just this information is not present in certain circumstances, or there's just not the right information or the right examples that are there. But this is the mission. This is what we're here to do, to recreate as many small ecological niches that are sustainable and to have them multiply. And I think that's going to be the work of the next 50 years, is just to recreate ecology through our intelligence and through our means. But there's always a way. The resources, they never go away. They just change, and it's up to us to adapt.
Well, you asked that, and you know, if one of us knew the answer to that question, I think we would definitely get a Nobel Prize. Or we should. But let me just quickly pick up on what we said about politics. Let's not forget, it's not politics and then society. It's us who put those politicians there, and they respond to what they think we want to see. At least they create a sort of illusion of that they're doing what we ask them to do. If we do not ask them, if we do not demand from our decision makers that we want environmental change, why would they do that? And give us higher taxes and less mobility and less consumer choice, and so they would get voted out immediately. So, you know, let's start with ourselves. Let's start in society, and let's create pressure on those in politics to enact this change, because that's what the voters want. And I think, you know, you asked, what can we do? I just wrote a book for which I stole the title of a great Spanish classic, El Gran Teatro del Mundo. And it is, I didn't write about Calderón. I wrote about the fact that in order to imagine a new world, you have to have the images in your head. It's not enough to think theoretically that, oh, this can be done, that technology is there, and this model can be applied. People need to have images. They need to have faces in front of them in their discussion. They need to connect emotions with this. And I think that's, for instance, where creative people come into that. That's also where social projects come into that, where that becomes real and palpable, perhaps only as a little bit of a reality, of a new reality. But all of a sudden, people see, hey, that's also possible. when I'm in this situation, I actually feel pretty good. When my children are in that, imagine, one little girl from Sweden, the conversations she kicked off on millions of dinner tables between parents and their children about how to live. And all of a sudden, a problem that seemed abstract to many people became very concrete because their kids were involved and their kids were asking questions and their kids were saying, why can't we do things differently? And that's where it starts, and that's where something positive becomes possible.
Sin embargo, ha habido un momento.
However, there has been a time when there was this contradiction between economic growth and wealth on the one hand, to care for the environment. They were set or presented in opposition, or at least partly so. Do you think we've overcome that mentality, that mindset, that stupid confrontation of both terms?
I don't think it's necessarily a stupid confrontation, unfortunately. We have wonderful dentistry, and we may soon have a vaccine, however limited that will be, for COVID. And we have democracy because we are rich societies. And that wealth came through use of fossil fuels and industrial revolution. These are the agreeable side effects of that huge surge of productivity and of pollution. And unfortunately, you can't disentangle the two entirely. And if we understand that we need to live not against, but with nature, that means consuming less. That means zooming less around the world. That means making a whole lot of life choices that in a consumer society are difficult to make, especially not just for already privileged middle-class people for whom that becomes a sort of virtue signaling that I'm only eating organic vegetables, but for a broad majority of people who don't have the money to buy that kind of vegetables, perhaps, who don't see the need, who just come out of poverty and for whom a full meal must contain meat, because otherwise it's not a proper meal. So, of course, once you come down to that level, it becomes a very complex problem. It becomes a very fine-grained problem. But we mustn't forget that what we have, the technology that allows us to talk at the moment, the money that went into this broadcast and that is fortunately there to get these ideas out there, are a direct product of the process that gives us such problems now, which is the overuse of fossil fuels and the pollution of nature and the destruction of biodiversity. And they're very difficult to disentangle. There is no one magic way of living virtuously in harmony with nature and retaining all those things. Democracies cost a lot of money. I'm always making everything more complicated.
I don't know if the listeners are appreciating this, but I certainly am. I think it's great to look at these things into the broader, historical perspective. And, conflict is important for evolution. Confrontation is important for ideas to evolve and I think it's important for everyone to seek discomfort in some ways, and that helps us grow. And our societies are going through that now with COVID, and I can tell everyone it's going to be a lot worse with climate change in the next 10 years because we definitely feel it. We know the impact that it has on what we do. So from discomfort can arise resiliency, can arise, strength, can arise growth. And I think, perhaps COVID is teaching us also to communicate in new ways. I'm certainly happy not to fly where you guys are to talk like this. This is a great step forward for me to be here in my greenhouse and to be able to share my ideas and to listen to others. And so, with the obstacle might be the way.
Precisamente, y a tenor de lo que comentabas sobre...
Yes, picking up on what you were saying about the consequences of COVID on society right now, some of them are quite self-evident. For example, those that are driving us to discuss or have this conversation through a technological tool like Zoom. But what do you think will happen later in the sort of midterm, not in the short term, with situations like this one? Because societies are becoming adapted to crises like the one we're going through for several reasons and with several consequences. But how do you anticipate this topic we're discussing now? And this is my last question, because we're running out of time. But how do you expect this crisis, this COVID-19 crisis, will affect us? Whether it will help us perhaps put the foot away from the accelerator, and perhaps we'll go to close markets, markets close at home, to local gardens like yours, and move or operate in terms of sustainable consumption.
Well, you know, I clearly can see that self-sufficiency and autonomy for states, for countries, for communities, for cities, for homesteads is going to be on the rise, which is not a bad thing. I think also that the term resiliency will become something that people will have to think about and think for themselves how they can become more resilient. That's going to be transformation for people, for communities. My biggest concern, which has nothing to do with farming, is personal relationships and contact. And I'm very scared about us not being able to touch one another anymore. And this is something that I feel is very unnatural for us. And the more enlightened and spiritual and happy you are, the more you just want to touch people and be with them and share. And, you know, I see that this disease is kind of creating new barriers that weren't there before. And on a whole other level, I'm very worried about that. And so I will just leave it at that.
Yeah, I share that. I share that both on a theoretical and on a very personal level. Also, I'm involved in music, and, you know, there are no more concerts, no more. I think, you know, we need our rituals, and for secular people, the rituals tend to be in concert halls or in outside festivals or in theaters. And if we are robbed of that, if we're robbed of these moments of community, almost of communion, that is something very critical, and I'm very deeply discomforted by that. Also by the physical proximity with other people, or the lack thereof. That is true. But, you know, of course our societies will change, and I think we mustn't have the illusion that COVID will vanish soon or that it will remain an isolated event. There have been many zoonotic viruses in the last years. Most of them were relatively harmless or relatively localized, but with the way that we are reaching deeper and deeper into nature, more will pop up, and more similar things will happen to us, never mind the secondary effects of climate change. But to close on a slightly more optimistic note, I think COVID also showed us one thing, and that will be terribly important for all our conversation over the next few years. People who criticize this neoliberal madness of a globalized, hypercharged economy were always told, yes, I know, it's terrible. We've all had conversations like that with, you know, clever people at the head of great corporations or with politicians also. And they say, yes, I know it's all very bad and it's a big tragedy, but what can we do? We can't stop the big machine. The markets must roll on. The machine of capitalism and of the globalized economy cannot be touched. And then came COVID, and within days it was. And within days, societies decided what we really want to protect are people who are not economically productive and who cost the state money, older people. Economically a folly. And also, it will have economic consequences that will be quite hard to bear. But I think what will not go away is that we have seen we actually have choices. We can do things differently if we want to. The big machine is not there like some god that we have to appease and that will go his way. But this is actually a product of our choices, this world we live in. And I think that will not go away for all the discussions that we have in future about what we can and should do with ourselves.
Pues ha sido un placer escuchar a los dos, a
It
Philipp
was
Blom.
a real pleasure to listen to you both, Philipp and Jean Martin, in this session at the Culture Forum to address all of these issues that have to do with climate change and the future of society and the role that we have to play in tackling these consequences. Philipp, Jean Martin, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to talk to you and with you.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias a quienes nos están escuchando también, por cierto, nos han estado viendo.
Thank you to our listeners and viewers. I will invite them to keep on enjoying the rest of the events in this year's edition.